So last night in San Francisco, I had the pleasure of attending a public lecture by the astrobiologist, geochemist, computer scientist, and I think speculative philosopher, Bruce Damer. He's really all of these things. And Bruce was presenting his hypothesis for the origin of life, some work that he has done with another scientist named David Deamer, whose lab is at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And their hypothesis is called the hot spring hypothesis, and it's the chief alternative to the deep sea vent, hydrothermal vent hypothesis for the origin of life. That deep sea vent hypothesis was sort of, came into being in the 1970s, and it's been an ongoing research project. And thus far, my understanding is that the chemistry there just doesn't work because of the salt water. It's very difficult to get bilipid membranes to form in salt water because the membranes get torn apart by the salt crystals, and if you can't get these membrane-bound vesicles to spontaneously emerge, you can't get the RNA and the organic chemistry to start metabolizing, to start doing what we know living organisms do, which is run through these cycles of experimentation and reproduction and inheritance and all of these things. So the theory that Bruce Damer and his colleagues are presenting, or the hypothesis I should say, is that if we imagine that life originated instead in freshwater geyser-fed ponds, then it turns out that there are more viable chemical pathways to understand all the steps that led up to life, including the formation of these bilipid membranes, these vesicles, these little packets of chemistry that can begin to experiment and boot up the process of natural selection. And so the idea is that, in these volcanic islands 4 billion years ago, there were all these amino acids raining down from space. This complex organic chemistry is kind of already made for us out there, and it rains down as comets and meteorites and seeds these pools, these freshwater pools, that are geyser fed, and so this geothermal activity is leading to these wet dry cycles, right? So the idea is the pond would fill up with fresh water from the geyser that erupts, and then the sun would evaporate this water, right? And so on the sides of these pools, you're getting this wet dry cycling, and the idea is that this complex chemistry began to form in this environment. And indeed, the experimental evidence suggests that this is a highly viable approach to understanding the way that complex organic polymers can be developed, chains of RNA, for example. And they've experimentally, Bruce and David Deamer and their colleagues, they've experimentally demonstrated that this sort of complex chemistry is possible in this environment, whereas the hydrothermal vent approach is having more difficulty demonstrating those viable chemical pathways. So then, Bruce has an interesting way of, narrating how he came to put the pieces together, the sort of theoretical pieces together. I mean, for him, it's very much a kind of visionary experience, a kind of, he's a computer scientist, so he likes to use computational metaphors. So he says that he receives these downloads, where he actually engages in a kind of imaginative conversation with the intelligence of the synchronous field, and is sort of led through and a recreation of these major steps in evolution by this intelligence in the synchronous field. And he explains how he came to an understanding of these three aspects of the evolutionary process that gets booted up in these geyser-fed pools. And he speaks in terms of, the acronym is PIM. It's the PIM cycle, and it's P is for probability. These are probability engines, right? These pools with their rhythmic cycling and these little vesicles of chemistry. They're probability engines. There's a process of interconnection. So Bruce will say that the common origin of life is not a single cell competing with others for survival and for resources in an environment with scarce resources, but rather the common ancestor is actually a community of cooperating protocells that are interconnected, and just like bacterial colonies today, they're sharing genes, sharing genetic material, let's say, across their membranes. And when a successful strategy is found, it's intentionally shared, or the gene that allows for the metabolic production of, say, a new enzyme to break down a new food source that hadn't yet been accessible to a community of bacteria. When that gene to produce that metabolic process is discovered, it's shared with the other bacterial cells in the colony. So this sort of horizontal gene transfer, it kind of undermines this whole notion of a struggle for existence among individual organisms. The origin of life, Damer's theory suggests, was a cooperating network of protocells, right? And so this interconnection part is the I, and then M is memory. And memory is something that life figured out how to run, right? It discovered the hardware for it when it discovered the nucleic acid sequences and the chemistry of that became possible, that was catalyzed by these chains of nucleic acids. And that started as RNA and then DNA, and so this is the M. So it's probability, interconnection, or interactivity, and memory. It's the PIM cycle. And Bruce's approach here, and this is where I start to have my own philosophical questions about what Bruce is revealing to us. He's claiming to have accounted for the leap from physics to biology, which is a difficult one for modern science. Given everything we know about the physical world, life appears to be highly improbable. It's far from equilibrium thermodynamically, and seems to be doing something highly improbable. So how do you explain this leap? Well, Bruce and his colleagues have found this viable chemical pathway between physics and biology. But the question for me becomes, if biology is this cycle of a probability engine generated by an interconnected community that has discovered a memory platform, some way of recalling and preserving the past and the responses made in the past, maybe the gap between, maybe what we've learned about biology from Bruce's team teaches us something about physics. And here I would have to credit the theoretical biologist Robert Rosen, who talked about how the understanding of biology as a complex system forces us to accept that physics was too special to have predicted complexity. In other words, if our understanding of the physical world gives us no indication of the complexity that is possible at the biological, and for that matter, the psychological and social and spiritual worlds, if our physics gives us gives us no indication of that, then there's probably something being left out of our physics. Our physics is probably too special, right? And it turns out that biology and the scheme of ideas that we can draw from biology that tell us something about reality, that scheme of ideas may in fact be more general than what we have thus far learned from physics. And so my point here is that maybe this PIM cycle in some other form is already going on at the physical world, at the physical level. Bruce said at one point that, from his point of view, when this PIM cycle starts with biology, the capacity to ingress novelty goes through the roof, and that for the 10 billion years of cosmic evolution before this moment of the emergence of biology, basically nothing was going on. He says the universe before life it kind of gets a D plus, or maybe he's a D minus in creativity, whereas the biological world, over the course of the last 3.5 to 4 billion years, has just ramped up the capacity to ingress novelty, right? Ramped up the organizational complexity and the improbability of the thermodynamic flows. But he also says, for the first 3 to 3.5 billion years of life, it was very simple bacterial communities that existed. And it was only, 600 million years ago or so with the Cambrian explosion that you get all these multicellular plants and animals that, along one line of evolutionary development became simians and primates and hominids and human beings. And so somehow this probability engine has booted itself up and become conscious. So there's, 3 different stages we can discriminate when we look at the history of the universe, right? There's cosmogenesis, biogenesis, and nuogenesis, right? The genesis of consciousness. So there's matter, there's life, and there's mind. And the difficult question is, how do these relate? A lot of thinkers that I've been deeply influenced by, like, Francesco Varela and Evan Thompson, they really identify mind and life, and they're biopsychists in that sense. Whereas I've been trying to push more for the more comprehensive Whiteheadian view, which isn't just biopsychism, it's panpsychism. So it's not just mind and life that have this intrinsic relationship. Physics also must be in some way intrinsically related to life and intrinsically related to mind. Whatever life and mind are, they must be compatible with physics, obviously, but they must, I say, also be expressions of physics. So again, if there's nothing in our physical description of the universe that gives us any indication that there might be biology or there might be consciousness, then our physics is incomplete. Our physics has failed to predict what we find around us and within us. It has failed to predict our capacity to do physics. If our physics cannot account for the possibility of knowledge, of a knowing, as one of the products of nature, then its picture of nature is incomplete. And I think some form of panpsychism, some form of integration of these 3 levels of mind, life, and matter is the more coherent view. I think, there's a scale of incoherence, right? I mean, we're never finally finished with our metaphysical description of reality. But I think, the most incoherent would be the view of reality that life and mind are just material. They're illusions and can be reduced by science, and that the goal of scientific investigation is to reduce mind and life to just a physical process. And the thing is, why would you want to do that? not for scientific reasons would you explain away your consciousness and your living existence and the living existence of the rest of the biosphere around you. You would not do that scientifically because, just empirically speaking, it's quite obvious that we're alive and that we are thinking. These are the most obvious features of our conscious existence that we would want to empirically describe as part of our scientific observation of nature, right? And so for Whitehead, nature is what arises in perception. Everything perceived is in nature for Whitehead. We can't pick and choose between, between nature as we experience it poetically and nature as we experience it physically, right? Somehow the experience of the radiance of the sunset, the beauty of the scene must be related to, it's an experience of the same universe described by physicists in terms of the waves of electromagnetic activity, right? So Whitehead's panpsychist view is an attempt to hold these three layers of reality together: matter, life, and mind. It's more coherent than the materialistic attempt to explain away life and mind, and I think it's also even more coherent than the mind and life approach, the biopsychism, because the approach that says that mind and life are coterminous, and that when you get the first living cell, there and then you get the emergence of an interior horizon of attention or awareness and intention or will. I think whatever we mean by will and feeling and desire when we talk about living cells, and their interior horizons of concern, as Varela would describe it, we're talking about capacities that must have been somehow prefigured at the physical and chemical level, that physics and chemistry must be more muted expressions of this same sort of, probability engine and interconnection and memory. There's memory present already at the physical world, right? There's interconnection and learning and this enhancement of probability already at the physical world. Because I would want to push back a bit with Bruce when he says that for 10 billion years the physical universe gets a D in creativity. First of all, time is kind of relative. Like 10 billion years is a flash in the pan. When you consider the complexity of galaxies and stars, just a frickin' hydrogen or helium atom is extremely complex, right? These aren't just little BBs. These are energetic patterns, relationships, musical scores, vibratory cycles that have been achieved in the course of evolutionary time. So the physical world it's been evolving at quite a clip. A star is a form of cellular organization, as is a galaxy. And by cellular organization, I mean these are self-organizing systems, right? These are on the same continuum as organisms at the biological level. And in fact, Whitehead just goes ahead and generalizes organism so that it applies beyond just the biological level of reality, but also to the physical. Because, we can talk about how life, the biological expression of life, increases the probability engine, and so you get more improbable results in the biological world than you do in the physical world. In other words, there's more speciation and diversification. There's a movement even further into neg entropy at the biological level than you get at the physical level in terms of the organization that is possible. But when we talk about probability, like, it's all relative, right? So how we can say that life seems more improbable a form of organization than chemistry and physics, but what's the probability of there being a physical universe? What's the probability of this physical cosmos having emerged from quantum randomness? How do you come up with a baseline for that probability? Is there a 0 point of probability? Because probability and statistics are complicated matters, I've gathered. Listening to statisticians and mathematicians talk about these things. But forgive me if this is not correct, but the probability of our universe existing seems to me to be 1. There's a probability of 1 that this universe exists, because here we are. In our universe, the only one we've ever experienced, consciousness exists, life exists. And so the only example of cosmogenesis that we know of is also a process of biogenesis and also a process of nuogenesis. So I don't know if we can really say that life is somehow disconnected from physics, or ever was, and that somehow we need this highly improbable miracle, whether it's the miracle of the geyser-fed pool, which Darwin was already describing in Origin of Species, the warm little pond. We don't really need a miracle to transpire in that pond. All we need is physics and chemistry and the rhythmic cycling, not only of the wet-dry cycle, but the Earth spinning on its axis around the sun. All this layering of rhythmic pulsation, right? It's at the level of the Earth spinning and rotating around the sun. It's at the level of the atom vibrating into resonance so that its protons and electrons and neutrons can all maintain their coherent and highly enduring, highly stable form of organization. Like, for Whitehead, atoms, helium and hydrogen, these are forms of organism. And they are a symbiotic achievement of smaller organisms, right? Subatomic particles. And this symbiosis, this ecological relationality, this networking effect goes all the way down for Whitehead. If we're going to describe a physical pattern at all, it's been achieved in the course of evolutionary time. There are no pre-existing enduring patterns in nature, but those which emerged in the course of evolution. And we have to generalize evolution beyond just the biological world, so that something like, what Bruce talks about so brilliantly, the PIM cycle, something like that goes all the way down. The fact that life can emerge in a geyser-fed pond through this cycling is an example of, or an indication of, the way that life is a geological phenomenon. It is literally what physics does, and we shouldn't be that surprised that biology emerges or that consciousness emerges, given what we know about the physical world. So 10 billion years is actually not that long for these, for our solar parents to have given rise to themselves. Stars are the parents of the heavier elements that compose life, right? And isn't it interesting that the organic chemistry, the compounds required to boot up life in these shallow geyser-fed ponds, it's all raining down from space, right? It's like it was prepared out there in an environment we usually think of as pretty harsh and inhospitable to life. Actually, that harsh, inhospitable, deep space of matter and energy has produced the seeds required for the geological processes of the Earth and its movement around the sun. It's provided the raw materials, or the ingredients, for the Earth in its dance with the sun and the moon to bring forth living cells, right? It's all an intricate dance, and the synchronous field is, Bruce's phrase. I really like that. And I think I'm just trying to push this a little bit further into a full-blown panpsychism, not just a biopsychism. But just some brief. Well, I guess this wasn't that brief. Some spur of the moment reflections on Bruce Damer's talk last night in San Francisco.